Hi folks, Steve here, and I'm just going to talk through the structure of the course for Australian cinema, obviously. Just really talking about the various themes, sections, and certainly films that we'll be looking at across the next 12 weeks. So the first section of entitled Australia and Foreign Locations. So this section basically includes Australian films which um, aren't entirely easily defined as Australian movies, right? So the first one in this series is Mad Max Fury Road, which I'm playing in black and chrome because it's cool. Um, Now, I think that's an interesting film in that, here is a film that's shot outside of Australia using predominantly American money, starring foreign actors, yet we still identify it as an Australian movie. Now, why is that? How much of this film pays due to the earlier Mad Max films, which were certainly Australian films? Those films were predominantly starring Australians or sort of actors who are identified as being Australian. And it's just interesting that here you've got a film that's it's almost like creating this sort of mythical Australia. And I'm really interested in the films that are kind of challenging the whole idea of what we think of as an Australian film. So Mad Max is one film. Then The Piano is another film that we'll be looking at in this sort of sequence of films. Now, the reading for this week, for the Piano Week, is by Ben Goldsmith. It's called Outward Looking Australian Cinema. That reading is crucial to understanding the course and what I'm trying to do with the course and the way I'm trying to set up the course through Australia and its international relationships and ties, and the way that things have become a bit more murky with what we think of as a national Australian film. And is the term national actually a redundant term? We'll be talking about that. But the interesting thing about The Piano is it's a film that is essentially a New Zealand film. It's shot in New Zealand. It's set in New Zealand. A number of the prominent actors in it, apart from Harvey Keitel and Holly Hunter, are Australian, from New Zealand. But Australian film funding bodies will claim this as an Australian film, and they did claim it as an Australian film for the central reason that all of the money was, a big majority of the money came from Australia. A lot of the pre-production was done in Australia, so it sort of goes beyond identifying Australian film through on-screen representation, actually looking at other aspects that are going on. Something else that I will be looking at for that week is the whole idea of the Gothic, the Australian Gothic, which sort of runs across the course. And in one of the readings for that week, it will sort of make an argument that there's this certain Gothic that's going on in Australian and New Zealand cinema, and actually looking at New Zealand is actually giving us a sense of Australia. There's this sense of Gothic that's sort of continuing across the two films. So I'm really interested to hear what you have to say about The Piano as an Australian film. So that is in that section. Also, in this section is Balibo, which is a film set. It sort of jumps back and forth from Australia, and that in itself is a very interesting thing to think about with an Australian movie. It's it's a true story about some journalists who were killed, and it's not essentially an Australian story. I mean, it's a story that affected Australians, in that Australians were killed, but it's traditionally not the sort of story that you're going to hear in your history class, and I'm really interested in that as well. So, what you've got in these three films is essentially a conversation about shooting locations, right? Does an Australian film have to be shot in Australia? And what happens if an Australian film isn't shot in Australia? And then that opens up for other films, like those American Hollywood films that are shot in Australia but aren't actually representing Australia. Okay, so that is the first section of the course, Australia and Foreign Locations. The next section is called Acting and Parodying Australia for International Audiences. So this section looks at the films that are really playing up particular myths and ideas of Australia for international audiences. At least two of the films in this section, also Mad Dog Morgan probably fit into this, films that are set at predominant tourist destinations. And what happens at those predominant tourist destinations. A film that we're not looking at, Wolf Creek, does a similar thing, where it takes that idea of the traveling, the tourist destinations, the scenic spaces and places of Australia that you would want to visit when you're in Australia, and sort of this horror that goes on there. Now, the first film in this section is Picnic at Hanging Rock. I've entitled this European Australia for the simple reason that Peter Weir is heavily influenced from European cinema. There's this thing now, this term called slow cinema, and Peter Weir was certainly demonstrating slow cinema before slow cinema was a thing. If anyone's wanting sort of this scarefest horror, you're going to be terribly disappointed because it's certainly not that. But it's a really wonderfully hypnotic film. And what these three films start to do is they start to talk about sounds, the sound of Australia. What is the sound of Australia, and how do we actually, what do we mean by the sound of Australia? Are there certain things in Australian films that just sound Australia and they have to therefore be identified with Australia, which again sort of goes back to The Piano, which is a very interesting film in that Jane Campion was, trained in Australia, studied in Australia, and she was very, very influenced and informed by Australian cinema when she made a film like that. Okay, so we're looking at Picnic at Hanging Rock, which is followed by Mad Dog Morgan. Dan Morgan was a bushranger, and this film is fantastic. I'm a huge fan of this movie, and it's that week is titled Foreign Actors and Acting Irish, because of course Dennis Hopper stars as the Irish bushranger Dan Morgan, or AKA Mad Dog Morgan. And it's interesting to look at foreign actors playing Australians or ideas of Australians. Although Dan Morgan was Irish, he was an Irish Australian. He lived in Australia his whole life. And then that would be followed by Meryl Streep in, to say that this is an iconic Meryl Streep film would be a bit ridiculous. It's almost like saying, There Will Be Blood is a good Daniel Day-Lewis movie, because Meryl Streep has done so many iconic movies. It's sort of hard to pinpoint one. But Evil Angels was a film that created a lot of interest at the time overseas, and also a lot of interest in Australia. There was huge debates, both with Mad Dog Morgan and Evil Angels, about whether Australia should be casting foreign actors to play Australians. And we can certainly have that debate. Interestingly, when Kate Winslet starred in The Dressmaker, she was not she didn't have to undergo such resentments, which may suggest that we've kind of moved on from that. But that will be an interesting discussion, I think, over those weeks, to look at films that are set in historical times, what they're doing with Australian history and histories, and also what they're actually doing with the casting of Australians and the way that particular myths are being sort of played for international audiences. Now, that would be followed by probably more on another section on performance, and that's Hollywood Australia Stars Breaking Out. So, all of the films that we're looking at in the course are breakout films in one degree of another. You know, breakout, whether it's a star establishing themselves or a director establishing themselves. But these three films are really about actors, a little bit about directors, but really about actors. So we've got Nicole Kidman in Dead Calm, and you can't really think of contemporary Australian cinema over the last 30 years without giving Nicole Kidman her due, because she has been a very dedicated actor in Australia and for Australia. And hugely, she's hugely indebted to the cinema. She invests a lot of her own time and money to perform in numerous Australian films, and it all really started with Dead Calm. And although she had done a number of films beforehand, like the wonderful BMX Bandits, which unfortunately I couldn't squeeze into the course, but it's worth having a look. But Dead Calm was the film that really launched her into Hollywood. And Nicole Kidman is a good example of getting international recognition allows her to actually come home and actually get up a number of films that probably wouldn't get up without her backing. And Dead Calm is kind of it's sort of a boat thriller. Let me just put it there. It stars Sam Neill, who gets a good run in this course. Sam Neill, of course, he stars also in The Piano. So we're looking at Nicole Kidman in Star Australia. That will be followed by Eric Bana in Chopper. And the interesting thing about Eric Bana in Chopper, and I want to talk about this, is in Australia, Eric Bana's Chopper was kind of a parody of Chopper in a way. Right? I mean, great performance, but he was essentially just, sending up, impersonating Mark Chopper Read, the notorious Melbourne gangster. But that film, when it played in America, and Americans weren't familiar with Mark Chopper Read, they didn't see it as Eric Bana impersonating. They saw it as Eric Bana acting. And it's interesting the way that different actors are perceived, or different performances are perceived in the country of their origin and elsewhere. And we'll be talking about that across the course also. And then after Chopper, we'll be looking at Proof, which is a Jocelyn Moorhouse movie. And it's a really great movie. So Jocelyn Moorhouse, of course, went on to direct The Dressmaker. And it stars Russell Crowe. And we'll be looking at this film as the one that really launched Russell Crowe into America and Hollywood. Russell Crowe, like Nicole Kidman, has continued to come home and make movies, but Russell Crowe has been a lot more antagonistic of the national industry. And he also he's also directed some films, so I should probably give him his due. And I'll also be talking about the failed attempt of Jocelyn Moorhouse to get Nicole Kidman and Russell Crowe together in a film that was an adaptation of a book called Eucalyptus, which never happened. But I think it says a lot about particular stars in Australia. The final section of the course, ladies and gentlemen, is focused on audiences. And in this section, we'll be looking at Shine, another based on a true story movie. We'll be looking at distributors and exhibitors. How do you actually get a film distributed? How do you get a film shown? Of course, Shine is another breakout movie for Scott Hicks, director, and Jeffrey Rush, the star of the movie. I mean, the film was kind of a two-hander in that it starred Jeffrey Rush and it also starred Noah Taylor playing both playing John Hillcoat, but it was Geoffrey Rush who was really launched. And Geoffrey Rush, let's not forget, did actually win an Academy Award for this performance, which is pretty incredible for an actor to win an Academy Award for an Australian movie. Following that, we'll be looking at film festivals and what happens when an Australian movie plays at international film festivals. How is it recognised as Australian or not as Australian, or misrecognised, and is that a problem? We'll be looking at Samson and Delilah. I'm playing Samson and Delilah because Samson and Delilah looks fantastic on the big screen on Blu-ray. Okay, if you've seen it and you didn't think much of it, or you haven't seen it and I don't know, you didn't think much of it, come and have a look at this film on the big screen. It looks amazing, and it's another film, like all of the films of this course, that look at the sounds of Australia, and I'm really interested in that. To wrap up the course is Jennifer Kent's The Babadook, which is a really, really interesting movie. It's a film that, in a number of ways, has a lot of comparisons and similarities to a film like Picnic in Hanging Rock. It's a film that is also really interested in European cinema, even though this is interested more in the kind of the creep out European cinema. I've entitled this week, The Babadook is not a horror, and I've said that because often I have a lot of students who just don't come to see The Babadook because they think it's a horror and they don't really care for horror. Well, it's not really a horror in the way that horrors are. Like, is it a horror? Well, guess it is a horror, but it's not like a horror that you expect. It's not a jump scare horror, all right? It's a very slow burning horror. It's a horror like, Picnic in Hanging Rock in a way. Like, it's more explicit than Picnic in Hanging Rock, but it's still a horror kind of like that. Anyway, so that's the course. They're the films, they're the themes, they're the sections, they're the weeks. I think there's wonderful films here to unpack over the number of weeks. And just remember, for 1 week, we will be discussing, films from other weeks and making comparisons. So please do make sure you are keeping up with the course, doing all the readings, and certainly watching all the films, because that is the best thing about doing a cinema studies course. Watching good movies. All right, I'll leave it there. Look forward to seeing you soon. Bye for now.